etymologically speaking, the games like Atmosphere, and there are a few of them, not that many, are kind of like the only real video games they are doing. Because like we call them video games, but they're really computer games.
Sure.
And the video is just an output device.
A brief message for our Spanish-speaking audience. Hola gente linda, este episodio está todo en inglés, pero mientras esperan a nuestro próximo episodio en castellano, si les interesa la obra de nuestro invitado de hoy, vayan a las notas de este episodio, que ahí les dejamos enlaces a nuestro artículo sobre sus juegos y a la entrevista de 4 partes que le hicimos la última vez que estuvo en Argentina. Besito! In this episode, we talk about politics, economics, game curation, artistic games, SimCity, the Anthropocene, Monolpoly, and the only real video games. Welcome everybody to the second ever English language episode of En Busca de Porko, a podcast where we celebrate and analyze the work of Porko, an Argentine indie game developer who made a bunch of weird games in the early 2000s. I'm David Marchand.
I'm Paolo Quarta.
And today we are with a very special guest. Would you tell us your name?
My name is Paolo Pedercini.
Excellent. And how would you describe yourself in a tweet?
In a tweet, I'm a game developer and I release most of my games as Molleindustria. That means soft factory, soft industry. I'm also a teacher, an educator. I teach at a university and I teach game design, but not exclusively that. And this is a long tweet.
This is a tweet longer.
A thread. And I'm recently I'm being also a curator, a game curator. So I organize events and I run a little space in Pittsburgh, PA, where I live in the United States, called LIKELIKE. I'm originally from Italy.
And this is your second time with us here in Buenos Aires, in this very apartment.
In this very apartment, yes.
Where we interviewed you, 3 years ago? That long? I think 2016, yeah.
Maybe?
16, yes.
16 was the very first year of Matajuegos. In Matajuegos, we've been very long admirers of Molleindustria. We wrote a few articles about your work.
We translated other ones.
We translated a few that you wrote, and we interviewed you. And we have very little time compared to other recordings that we've made. So do we want to...
I would talk about why we have such little time. We have come together because of Game On and Gaia, which are 2 events that are running in Buenos Aires this week. Game On is an exhibition of, would you say art games? Games as art, games as culture? How would you describe it?
I would say that it's kind of like the arty side of independent games.
Okay.
I think the tagline is art and culture, like a game, juegos and art or something.
Juegos en el arte. No.
Arte en juego.
Which is a play on words.
Art at play.
At play.
Yeah, but it's a play, but it's also like risking itself.
Sure. In Spanish it is more of a pun.
Yeah, and they're exhibiting over 40 games from all over the world. Some are Argentine, some are from the United States, some are Italian. We have a bit from everywhere. And then there's Gaia, which I keep forgetting what it stands for. It's Games Association.
Game Art in
International Association.
Well, that's the game. But yeah, it's a gathering of game art curators and event organizers. It's part of a kind of like a network that is being kind of like put together as we speak. Really, it's the first of its kind, and the idea is to essentially share ideas and share skills and also brainstorm for the future among our very like limited group but very dispersed around the world of people who are essentially organizing events like Game On. Things that are kind of like somewhere in between art but not quite, somewhere in between like a festival but not just like a commercially oriented sort of like a GDC, IGF type of festival.
Right.
So it's 20 of us, and we're gonna basically have a retreat for this weekend, plus some public-facing, more like normal talks. But most of it is kind of like workshopping.
That's right. And yeah, I've had the privilege to join some of these folks for dinner and lunch, and just to hear about all the exhibits they put on all across the world. And I'm very jealous and very envious. Game On is wonderful, but I want to go to all these other events as well.
We have one representative from Amaze in Berlin. We have one representative from the Playful Art Festival, which is actually like not quite video games and not quite board games, but they're more like performative things that are happening in the cities, especially in the Netherlands. And we have
Wild Rumpus.
Wild Rumpus, yes, which was one of the early ones that exist also within more like commercial things. They've been making parties and events and stations also at GDC, for example, and people like that.
Yeah.
Isabella Verse, a French curator that has been kind of like working for many years, and she's basically going around the world looking for like independent game scenes outside of United States, Europe, and Japan.
She was here an hour ago.
Yeah, she interviewed us for Metajuegos as part of her project.
Yeah, it makes totally makes sense. So to see like expand essentially the conversation beyond.
Yeah, she was telling us about a lot of games that she was playing and she was seeing in places like Taiwan, India, South Korea, Japan. I took her workshop last weekend about machinima, using a lot of those very same games to make short videos.
Apparently we talked to you last time in 2016, so whatever you want to update us on of what you've been working with.
Yeah, so I would say like since 2016, I've been releasing small games pretty much, every year I release maybe like 2, 3, 4 games or like little projects. But I think the biggest thing so far, well, I'm working on a longer game, a bigger sort of like story game that I'm not ready to talk about it. It's not announced. Okay. But so I have like a big project that is going to be a long-term thing. But the thing that happened since 2016 is that I essentially opened this small gallery. It's like it's kind of like a big room. It's like a big garage that is in my garage essentially, but it's like very well prepared to exhibit that kind of like digital art stuff, in particular games. And so it's somewhere between an arcade, like Sal Giochi arcade, and a gallery. An art gallery, and it doesn't quite look like neither of them. And what we've been doing is essentially putting together an exhibition of like 6 games every month, and every month there is a new exhibition, and it's on a different theme, and the theme is very narrow. It's like things like public transportation in games, or things like bad things about flirting. And sometimes they are centered around maybe like 1 or 2 main games, and sometimes they are just like centered around like a curatorial theme.
Are these games made for like, or these games that you find and then put together around a theme?
Yes, they are mostly games that already exist. Although pretty much every show, every of these like one night monthly shows, I try to add kind of like a project that is essentially not on the internet. Maybe it's not screen based. Maybe it requires some like alternative hardware.
Right.
Maybe it is a game that has been unreleased.
Sure.
And sometimes, and actually quite often, we produce one piece that is produced for the occasion. And sometimes I try to tie in basically like the projects I'm working on or I'll be interested in. And that's kind of like the most interesting thing as practitioner. It gives me the excuse to start side projects that I will never really care about, because I will never have like wanted to send these things to the festival circuit. Sure. Like right now, I collaborated with a friend and we put together an augmented ping pong table. So it's like a normal ping pong table, has 2 contact microphones on each side, and then there's a Maximus T patch that detects the bouncing balls. And all the lights, there are 8 lights in the room, are responding with patterns or changing different modes, and there is like dynamic music that is happening timed on the bouncing balls.
That sounds wild.
Yeah, I have like a short video that sort of gives the idea, but it's quite interesting and it's created for that space.
We do have a pretty extensive notes sections on the podcast, so you'll find the video on the podcast notes. Yeah,
that sounds like prime ground for seizures.
Yes, we had like a very big notice, like seizure warning notice, because it can be pretty intense. The idea is that you're playing ping pong normally, and it gets kind of like increasingly more intense, or it kind of like messes with your perception. The lights go off, and there's like black light that make everything fluorescent. To kind of.
And I imagine the ball is fluorescent.
Yeah. Things like that.
And what's the Pittsburgh scene like for that kind of curation project? Are there people who come? Are people excited? Are there devs? What kind of people show up?
Mostly normal people, actually, not so much like game people, and that's part of the sort of like the way the gallery works is that it's connected to a gallery crawl, a bigger event that is more about art. So they are more like art leaning people, but not on the pretentious sort of like side, not like museum high art people. They are more like people who are just using the art gallery experience as a way to kind of like hang out with, see friends, drink a bottle of wine or something. So I think that's a curious people, very diverse, which is often a problem with more like institutional art stuff, that you either get like, like high art people that tend to be like a bit more privileged or educated. So that's like actually kind of like I wouldn't say working class, but it's definitely like a little bit like less pretentious as a crowd. And most importantly, they are not gamers.
Right.
And that was a bit of an issue that I had with several like things like, for example, like Wild Rumpus, right? They curate this like a beautiful space, but it kind of like exists within GDC, right?
Yeah.
You have to sort of like chip in and like, pay like several $1,000s, and it's almost like I don't want to think about the independent experimental world as something that is almost like a subset of the game world.
Right, so that is hidden in there. You have to get into, and you have to kind of dig your way to find.
Yeah, because one thing that I see every time, like every show after show, is that people actually like experimental games. They like weird games. People are not gamers because they don't like mainstream games. They think they are boring or not stimulating enough. So if you present them something like different, something that is not mirroring, basically like the first-person shooter or like a controller-based, twin-stick controller-based action-adventure or match 3 phone game. So basically like the stereotypes, the mainstream stereotype of the game. If you present them some product that is not like that, actually people get into them.
Sure, yeah.
They're like, I never thought games could be actually personal or political or interesting.
Hopefully. I'm trying to bring my mom to Game On tomorrow or the day after. So
I think she'll love it.
I'm sure.
I don't know if she'll play anything, but I think she'll be... Your mom is very enthusiastic about things in general, so I think she'll have a very good time.
We do have in Matajuegos, we just started a kind of very online curatorial effort called Matajueguitos, where we pick some sometimes old web games or games that you can find on the web, and we produce a short video with a theme and games that respond to that theme, and the aesthetics of the video is sort of like an art gallery. I don't think that qualifies for Gaia, but
no, and I think the premise there is to. I think this was based on another video essay you saw, and it was about being less critical of small independent games, of promoting them rather than making big, long critical analysis of small games, because they don't have the backing to really support that.
Yeah, and Liz Ryerson just published an article that is more or less about that.
Yeah,
I'm translating it now for Matajuegos.
Okay, and trying to support more small games, taking 5 minutes to briefly mention them and giving them a showcase, really.
And another thing you just said that like sometimes you pick like older games, and that's something that I'm also trying to do, because sometimes in the festival sort of like event, if you're putting together a game event, you're sort of assuming that most of your people and crowd is like a very like game oriented, especially in North America. Like, these are like all game people, and therefore if they go to a festival, they want to see the game they don't get to play normally, and so like they want to see the unreleased game and so on. So this is something that we are avoiding with like we are just like showing games that are sometimes even like 10 years old. Why not? Because most people don't play those games anyway. So
speaking of non-gamers, of people who aren't into games coming and finding an avenue to games through alternative controllers and showcases, we have a very big alternative controller and independent arcade scene. And one of the games that tends to feature there and in a lot of other events is Dobotone, which has also toured internationally now, and which has a very classic kind of Atari feel, but it's just 2 buttons per player. And that's all you need to approach it. And kind of, it's a multiplayer game. You play with 3 other people, and they're all very simple mini games, one to the other, just pressing those 2 buttons. And
there is one player who has more than 2 buttons.
Yes, well, I didn't want to complicate it, but there is one person who can
tweak
and manipulate the console to change the parameters, so making the gravity way more, way less, making it go faster, go slower.
I'm familiar with the project, and I'm kind of like curious to see it. I think tonight.
Yeah, I think you'll probably see it tonight.
Yeah, but the controller is actually very important. I think they got something right, because I think the controller, more than the content or the mechanics or whatever, the genre, the controller is, I think, the single most important block for people who are not used to play games. They see a controller, got a lot of, like, an infinite amount of buttons, like there's a lot of things that we take for granted, like, oh yeah, of course, camera, right stick, or essentially there's a controller literacy that most mainstream games assume, and also a lot of indie games assume, that people just don't have, especially related to the standardized twin stick controller.
Right. I remember when they were showcasing it one of the first times at an event in La Plata, so many children were playing it. So many children who was one of their first times playing with games and just loving it. And a lot of parents who aren't accustomed to games.
Yeah, for sure.
Just coming
and there's also a nice, with the Botone, that you might know as the Botone, depending on where you come from. There's a nice dynamic where a more knowledgeable or gamer type player can occupy the
console.
The console, so everyone who isn't so savvy can pick up the simple 2-button controller and have the experience enhanced by the person who has more experience with the same game.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about Lychenia, even if just briefly.
Likenia.
Likenia, okay.
Yeah, but I guess like my fellow Americans, I guess. Likenia is a kind of like I call it a city building game, but it doesn't look like a city building game at all. It's kind of like more like an abstract game, and it's part of my Invisible Cities sort of like inspired series of alternatives to SimCity.
Okay.
So the idea is that SimCity has got a lot of problems, and I'm gonna fix them, but not by making one SimCity, but making a multiplicity, like a series of smaller city games that are focusing on very specific issues, and they are sort of like in dialogue with SimCity.
And you say this was inspired by the Calvino's Invisible Cities?
Yeah, to some extent. In that Calvino like kind of like uses the city as a way to talk about many things that are not necessarily cities, but they are memory, semiotics, things like that. But uses like very short sort of like glimpses in this particular, and essentially like not trying to simulate a system that exists like SimCity does or City Skyline does, but try to simulate kind of like an imaginary city as a way to talk about something.
Sure.
So Likenia is basically about the Anthropocene, or the idea that we humans are in charge of the planet, and we are defining this geological era. Like our impact is the main impact, the main like determining factor for how the planet sort of like changes these days because of CO2 emissions, greenhouse effect, and so on. So the game, it's relatively simple to play. You're just getting some types of cubes that are actions on this particular like abstract landscape, and these cubes have some kind of effect, kind of like dynamic effect. Like there is a green cube that sort of like grows some greenery stuff, some forests and so on. Like the blue cube displaces some water, and then there's like a city sort of ruin cube that kind of like creates a starting point for a ruin, and you can essentially create a kind of like a built environment, or something that looks like a built environment, and then things like that. There are like five types of cubes that are essentially actions to that. And while you're playing, you're also having a kind of like a narrative that sort of like in a magical realist style tells you what is going on. Or what you are doing, gives you a little bit more like grounding to understand what this action is doing. And so you're sort of like learning that essentially the city you're building used to be a city, but you're sort of like regenerating the city. So if something went wrong, maybe it's post-apocalyptic, and you're trying to fix it or rebalance it.
Right.
And that's kind of like based on the idea, or a few ideas actually. One is that simulation games, especially city simulation games, tend to always start with a blank slate. With like they start from like a nature, and you start to put buildings in this nature. Although of course you can start with scenarios that already exist. But so like what if you're starting from kind of like a city that went wrong, and you're sort of like trying to fix it. And the other main idea is that nothing is really like immediately understandable, and you sort of have to figure out how each of these cubes or these actions work and sort of like make your own interpretation, which is speaking of like non-gamer, that is actually a very like a difficult thing to do, because people are expecting to be communicated what each gameplay affordances does to the thing. So the idea is that it's a bit more like gardening, that you're trying something and see what happens, and then you're sort of like experimenting and learning how the system works. The system is relatively simple, like kind of cellular automata based stuff, but there are a few interactions that are somewhat surprising. It's not
I was very surprised by the one, basically the glitch cube is what I kind of referred to it by when I was playing
I call
it.
Glitch cube.
Oh, okay, well there you go. Which kind of starts to spread out, and I don't remember right now if it sets things back to a neutral state or what it does exactly, because it's been a little while since I played it, but I remember it being beautiful and being surprising, like you say, just the idea of you just planting something, and even depending on where you plant it, has a slightly different effect on how it spreads through the landscape. And the idea that there's a limited amount of stuff you can build. There's a bar that kind of measures how you're balancing out the 5 different cubes. And even that the resolution to this whole era of building resolves differently depending on what that balance is like, if I'm not wrong.
The resolution doesn't. There is. There are some kind of endings or some states that are based on that balance. Yeah. And the other thing is that the graphics are generated by machine learning, so it looks kind of like glitchy, but not the typical glitch. It's basically a colleague and friend of mine, Everest Pipkin, fed this neural network with a bunch of classic isometric tiles found online, and then told the machine learning, the neural network, to basically barf a million of like imagining like hallucinated tiles. So they did it as a kind of like a standalone project, released the tile set, and we're like, use it. And I happened to just work on this project, and it seemed like really fitting, because I kind of wanted, like, if you see these tiles, they have a kind of quality to it that is not quite natural and not quite built environment, a lot of them, even though I do use the green as a kind of like more natural thing, but I try to make it a little bit more ambiguous, whether a thing is natural or artificial.
I just wanted to talk about, like, because I saw it and it intrigued me just because it was so beautiful and very mysterious, especially since it doesn't discreetly explain anything, but just the interactions were, it was just a very haunting game, also because of the Anthropocene and because of those very cryptic messages you get along the way as you play. And I just think, just aesthetically, it's a beautiful game.
I didn't play it.
Yeah.
I'm getting a lot of Starship Pilgrim vibes.
A little bit. There is a lot of growing, yeah.
Yes, it was kind of like, it's my attempt to do something like Starship Pilgrim, but like failed attempt, because people are like, I don't get it. While Starship Pilgrim is a little bit more grounded on the platforming sort of thing, and it kind of like encourages you to actually, but that's the idea. Like, to me, that's the most interesting boundary to push, like a game that is interesting to learn to play, that doesn't tell you like what things are.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if there's any other closing remarks on Gaia or Game On that we wanted to touch upon, aside from saying, that it's great that these things happen in Buenos Aires every once in a while.
Yeah. And all the people in the rest of Argentina are complaining that
it happens in Buenos
Aires.
And they're right. And that we have, 20 plus international curators running around the center of Buenos Aires, eating our food, and,
Yeah.
So that wraps it up for the first segment, and we're going to go to a commercial break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about a Porko game called VHStanciero.
VHStanciero.
Do you pirate most of what you watch? Is your hard drive getting full? Do you wish there was a way to store all of those TV shows and movies without taking up so much digital space? Are you inexplicably biased against DVD? Reach out to the Cassettinizer Club. Send us any video file and have it mailed to you in VHS form for a reasonable price in mere months. And Busca de Porko is sponsored by the Cassettinizer Club. From gigabyte to kilogram or your money back.
Welcome back, everybody, to the second segment where we are going to speak about this game made by Porko called VHStanciero or VHStanciero, depending on how you're pronouncing it.
We have a lot of things to explain.
Yes, so many things to explain to an English-speaking audience.
Well, one thing you might already be familiar with is the idea of board games that are played with kind of a video augmentation, a video component, like the game Atmosphere, which I'm told is popular. I've never played it. I've never seen it.
I played it once with my sister and friends. They gave it to her for her birthday.
The idea of Atmosphere is that you're playing a board game and you have kind of a dungeon master on the TV. You put in a DVD, or back in the 90s when this came out, a VHS into a TV. And the dungeon master would, change the rules of the game?
Yes, it's definitely like a legacy of like VHS era. And then, you imagine like you're playing a board game. The board game is actually kind of boring, kind of like busy work, and not that interesting, because the main gimmick is this guy that shows up in your TV, and you have like the TV next to you, that shows up at random times and basically changes the rules, or it essentially produces random events. That is basically a random event generator. And mechanically, how it does it is very simple, because like the VHS is just linear. You press play, and that's it. Like, there's no randomness in that.
Right.
But the way it works is that the guy, the actor, will say, whoever is playing right now, whoever's turn is it, you raise your hand, like, who's playing now, and then, like, you have this choice that usually sometimes it's like dilemmas. You can fuck with the other players, or you can, you're just, like, being punished, essentially.
And I think you have to raise your hand and say, yes, master.
Yes. Yes, there is, like, a very, like, sadomasochistic sort of, like, idea, which is probably, like, taken from dungeon, like, tabletop role-playing games. But it is definitely, like, a normal, like, old-time board games atmosphere. They're very popular to some extent in the West.
And it is a very dungeon mastery kind of figure that talks to you, right?
I think he's called the Dungeon Master, if I'm not mistaken. Not in Porko's case, but in the Atmosphere original.
Okay. Well, I don't know if Porko played Atmosphere at some point in his youth, in the 90s, when the economy in Argentina was booming, and you might be able to get a game like Atmosphere.
We looked it up. Atmosphere came out in 91, so it's very likely that he played it, if he ended up making such a similar game.
But the series kind of like continued all the way throughout the DVD era. So there were like some more like recent iterations.
I played it on a DVD. It was still, I don't know if it was completely linear or there was some randomness to it. The only interaction I remember was if time ran out and the whole video played out, you lost, and the dungeon master laughed at you and you all lost. But if you won, if one player reached the center of the board, you had to hit a certain button in the DVD controller, and the dungeon master went all the way, no, impossible, no, you escaped.
And you defeated the dungeon master.
Yes, exactly.
But I like the idea that, very like etymologically speaking, games like Atmosphere, and there are a few of them, not that many, are kind of like the only real video games they are doing. Because like we call them video games, but they're really computer games.
Sure.
And the video is just an output device, and it's just various sound, various like controllers. But those are like really kind of like centered around the medium of video.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. And well, Porko's game.
Yes.
VHStanciero. He obviously had a camera at home, for home movies or something, and he set it up to record himself with this kind of like carnival pig mask that he put on.
Yes, and a hood.
And he plays very much this dungeon master role over a game of what here in Argentina we call Estanciero, which is a rip-off version of Monopoly, when getting the rights for Monopoly and publishing it here was a little dicey. It's just like Monopoly, except it's, instead of having a square board, a square kind of circuit you run through, it's a hexagonal for copyright reasons. You still have money, you still have like little hotels, except instead of hotels, the idea is that it's kind of got this countryside aesthetic. So you actually have like ranch houses and like farms.
Yeah, Estanciero, as far as we looked it up, literally means ranch owner.
Yeah. The idea is that you're a very wealthy landowner, ranch owner, much like wealthy ranch owners in Argentina.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I remember playing it like 4 years ago, last time I was here, and you pulling out this VHS, and I kind of like kept thinking about it ever since. So like occasionally I keep thinking about this, because to me it was like two different things. First, like you have your own version of an official version of Monopoly, and Monopoly has various different themes and itself, like the very fraught history that it was basically originally an anti-monopolistic game, and it was basically the first political game ever made, and then got ripped off by Parker Brothers and whatever, and then like the Argentinians are sort of like making their own version like that is a complete rip-off. So that was like pretty fun. But then like there is this random obscure guy that records a tape that is kind of like a hack or like an augmentation, an unofficial mod of this game.
Yeah. And this was just a personal thing, but seeing him with this, it was obviously great. It's an old VHS and it's kind of grainy, it's got a little static. And he's got this pig mask, which is a fairly happy pig. It's not meant to be scary at all.
I think it's meant to be scary, but it didn't come out that way.
And he's kind of in this dark room. He's very close to the camera, but the room is obscured, obviously, because it must have been his living room or his own room. But it very much gave me Saw vibes because of the pig assassin in Saw. And obviously, I don't know if that was the intent, because I think Saw came out quite a couple of years after this game.
I assume after, yeah.
Yeah.
And I've been wondering if the pig is just a reference to, well, you're a farm and therefore it's a pig, or is more like the pig, the capitalist pig type of situation.
I don't know. The first game we reviewed for this podcast, Chancho Quest, was all about a pig and animals' rights and a pig escaping the...
Or not escaping
the slaughterhouse, trying to escape the slaughterhouse. I think in the TXT, Porko said that he was either vegetarian or a vegan, or was becoming one. And I don't think that decision stuck for many years after.
But he kind of kept that kind of Porko nickname ever since. Because that was supposed to be the author of Chancho Quest was the pig. He was kind of told from the pig's perspective.
I think he has a whole tirade in that TXT about not using the obvious Porko equals bad, pig equals greedy aesthetic, which he completely betrays for this game.
This game and for Midnight Snack and for a couple of other ones, suddenly in some of his games, the pig is this kind of very negative stereotype, in this case of kind of capitalist economic greed, as it ties to landowning.
100%.
So I'm trying to remember how the game actually played out, because now it's been like a few years and I've been like maybe like making stuff up. Like you're kind of like doing your Monopoly thing, essentially buying properties, growing properties, and the video is there and there's nothing going on. There's like basically a blank, like an empty room or something, or a black screen, and then occasionally this guy shows up, this pig shows up wearing a mask and says something in Spanish that you have to translate, obviously. Or like say my understand, and we'll say something like, "Oh, inflation hits, and now like your money is like worth less, and so you have like double money, but also the price is double as well." So things like that. What were other like kind of like random events that were showing you?
The strongest one that relates to Argentine politics, I think, is inflation, because Porko obviously was making this in the early 2000s. We already had the hyperinflation during Alfonsin's presidency, and then the whole thing that led to the 2001 crisis in Argentina. I don't think we explicitly said this, but just to clarify, we did show this game to Paolo because we thought it was an interesting political game related to his political work the last time we were in Argentina. We had a fun time playing the game. I don't think it super holds up as a fun, super balanced game.
I don't think it was ever balanced.
But it is a nice experience.
Because the thing about, for example, the inflation, if you create an inflationary mechanics on an existing board game, then you kind of like have the risk of running out of fake money, right?
Yeah.
So I think one of the mechanics that I like the most is he introduces a very Argentine thing, which is at a certain point, one of the colors that you're kind of not supposed to be using at the beginning of the game is the dollar equivalent. And you kind of need to trade the other bills for this dollar, which keeps changing in price as the game goes on. Because just to set up kind of the 2001 economic crisis in Argentina, for the majority of the 90s under neoliberal politics, we had one-to-one equivalency with the dollar. 1 peso was worth $1.
An absolutely fake and forced one-to-one equivalence.
And that bubble burst horribly in 2001, leading to a huge economic recession, economic crisis, in which a lot of people lost their life savings. And suddenly, the peso was worth way less. I mean, it was at that time, it balanced at 3-1 instead?
I have no idea. I think maybe 3-1. Yeah.
So 300% inflation, which is very similar to what's happening now in Argentina. So it's a very similar situation. But he introduced that mechanic into
Or wasn't there a mechanic about, like, are there, like, facilities, like, maybe, like, a train station or something like that? Are there, like, I'm trying to remember, like, what the game was. But I think there was an event that introduces a kind of, like, liberalization of trains or water services. And so, like, this event happens and you have to bid on buying, essentially privatize. It doesn't work quite well if people already own those things, but if they don't, you might end up like privatizing this services.
Yeah, I remember that being one of the sticking points. One of the things that stuck with me. It's been a while since we played the game. Our VHS player does not work anymore. It broke since the last time you were here, unfortunately. So we can't quite refresh our memories. But yeah, there was like this Estanciero, at least one of the versions that we played with, has buildings that are supposed to be train stations or supposed to be public facilities that this horrifying pig man on this TV will suddenly privatize because there's no government in the Estanciero originally. There's a bank, but very much Porko introduces the idea of a government or a government entity into the game.
I think it's weird thinking about the fact that Porko now works for a bank.
Yeah, now that you mention it.
But he had all of this in his head at some point. Yeah. And he got some use out of the camera, because if you read the TXT for Porko vs. Dex, his Mortal Kombat parody, he explains that they had a pretty cool camera that they were using for recording the sprites of themselves fighting and doing all the Mortal Kombat actions. So I would guess it's the same camera being applied to this.
It might be. It's very different settings. This is very close. This is very close screen. It's a home setting, while Porko vs. Dex is filmed outside.
Yeah.
But I remember my uncles had a camera for home movies that me and my cousin were wild about. We used to film ourselves doing the news, and we would just make up news. And it seemed like a very similar setup, just at Porko's house, just playing around with the camera. But he decided to hack El Estanciero.
Yeah.
And some events were not even like tied to a gameplay rule. It was more about like enigmatic, like think about this, or like this happens, but there is no actual mechanical effect on that. It's almost like flavor or like a cutscene or something. Yeah, sure.
I think there was an event when he just said this and this and this happened. Our economy lost some amount of trustworthiness. Feel bad for the next 4 turns, and that's right. that's the whole instruction. It has no effect at all on the mechanics. You just have to think that you're feeling bad.
And I think when the game came out, it was still fairly close to when Crazy Cow Disease was kind of this thing that was popularized by media. So you would have kind of this cow laughing in the background every once in a while when it says, "Oh well, Crazy Cow Disease," kind of sweeps through the fields. Mm-hmm. It was very strange. It's
one thing I remember that Atmosphere did really well, even though it was super obvious and broke the illusion a bit, is that when you were nearing the end of the video, the Dungeon Master started introducing a bunch of really extreme measures that sped up the game. So it was really, really easy to either win or lose in the last 10 minutes, which made you feel like the first half an hour of the video was kind of pointless, because either way, the Dungeon Master was going to end with a climactic battle and run for the center of the maze. I don't think Porko made anything like this for this one, so I think the more we played it, the more it felt like it was coming out of sync with our situation. At the beginning of the video, it was very clear that the video was speaking about situations that we felt like they were happening in the game, and the more we advanced, it was more and more obvious that the situations and events that the Porko character presented were less specific, because he had no idea what was happening in the board. Anything could be happening in the board.
Right.
So I think he could have better learned the lesson from Atmosphere about racking up the tension.
I don't know how much you playtest of the game, because it is a lot easier to know the initial state of the board than to know what it is half an hour down the line, and to kind of balance for that. And we know that Porko has never been great at balancing things.
I'm fairly sure he knew about Atmosphere. I don't know that he played it. Yeah. Really?
It does look like something made by somebody who has heard about a game, or I've seen it maybe like the commercial on TV, and kind of like almost reverse engineer or makes up something that ends up being more interesting than the original thing.
Yeah, sure.
I think this is a great way to come up with new ideas, like misheard something, or just make a game based on a game that you never made, never played.
That's a great game jam prompt, actually.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, in a way, it's a lot worse than Atmosphere because it's super unbalanced, and in many ways it's a lot better than Atmosphere because thematically it explores many interesting things that Atmosphere would never explore.
I actually played Atmosphere like rather recently, like maybe 2 years ago, and it's not balanced actually. Like it's because of that sort of like climatic thing that makes makes wild swings. It kind of like almost invalidates the first half. The first half of the game,
it does.
The early game is not very important. You're sort of like warming up. So maybe it's better if it gets like a little bit more rarefied or more abstract or more conceptual, because I like it as a kind of like a trolling of the player and a trolling of maybe Monopoly itself, or
let's admit Estanciero and Monopoly have never been particularly fun to play after the first half hour anyways.
I like the idea that if you could potentially do it right now, that you could create like VHS or like DVD or like even YouTube videos for that are meant to complement games that are already existing, and it wouldn't really be an infringement of any sort. It's like almost like playing a movie with like a commentary soundtrack or like a different soundtrack or something like that.
I think maybe after this podcast we need to record a little segment about the history of Estanciero, because I think that'd be actually pretty interesting. I don't know what the history of it is.
Actually, I changed my mind. I don't think David should record or edit an extra segment for this episode. Besides, historical research is boring anyway.
And I think one of the things that you were saying, David, about how wild and just how broken kind of the game becomes towards the second half, or like after the first half hour, 45 minutes of play, and just how wild what Porko is saying, what the pig is kind of the new rules that he's imposing on the game. I think it portrays a widely unbalanced country and economy that maybe Porko felt he was going through, a world that is
for sure
increasingly becoming less recognizable and understandable in how wild the swings are, how hard it is to comprehend.
Because to me, the main issue of Monopoly has many issues, but the main issue is that in Monopoly you're basically like simulating this rather perfect market in which you are all entrepreneurs, and so with a combination of luck and strategic investments, you eventually succeed, and the person who succeeds the most gets better, means to succeed even more, and so there is a bit of a snowballing, which is a good thing to have in a game, so the game ends eventually. So you have this thing, but it's always on the very first considering the business as usual. There's no bubble. There's no macroeconomics essentially. It's all microeconomic, and that's a very important kind of debate in how people should consider macroeconomic versus microeconomic.
Yeah, it's kind of like a libertarian ideal.
Essentially, yes, like the neoliberal sort of doctrine.
Contracts between individuals.
It basically assumes that you can just extrapolate normal these ideas of greed and self-interest and apply it to the larger scale. But then the more Keynes, the third way, the other schools of economics that have been historically kind of marginalized are essentially saying that there's a sum of the parts, there's a whole that is more than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, and one thing that I think I read once in an article by you, maybe about SimCity, is that at some point you have to choose where the simulation stops and how you represent or model the outside forces. So obviously it is extremely hard to simulate the whole macroeconomic system. So maybe the easiest path is I'm going to be a gigantic pig character who looms over the entire individual economy, and I'm gonna introduce randomness and forces.
Yeah, I think random events are often used in games like that, right? Like, oh, something happens, like even in SimCity, or like something happens that is not exactly part of the core gameplay loop, right? But it represents something that it's not worth simulating. It's just affecting. You just get some like inputs from this outside world, this cloud outside your core mechanic. And the interesting thing is that I think like I don't know about like Estanciero, but Monopoly has, I think you have a discino cards, right? You have chances, but even those are like microeconomic. They are like individual. You get an inheritance or something, or they are like all like never like really related to the bigger system and the bigger economical system. And to me, it's almost like it makes sense that something like that comes from Argentina, who has been in many ways subordinated to like a bigger, like a neoliberal sort of like policies throughout history, versus like in the United States. Oh, sure, it's all about the individual entrepreneur, because you don't have another government actively fucking with you, nor like supporting dictatorships and so on.
Right.
And something that I wanted to add is, even especially like in Monopoly or SimCity, where you have these even these slight representations of macroeconomics or even of natural disasters in SimCity, the player's role is always restoring the utopian fantasy and the status quo. You have the storm or you have the catastrophe come in, but your challenge as a player and what you can very easily do is restore how things were functioning before, which in VHStanciero you cannot do.
Yeah.
There is no returning to the perfect point of balance or to that that neoliberal fantasy. The system is broken. It is broken for the rest of the game.
Yeah.
And it will keep on continuing to break in different and funny ways.
I mean, they're funny when they're fictional. They're funny.
Yeah.
But I think it's time to like really take this as a signal and kind of like make VHS add-ons for all sort of games. I'm looking at all the games that you have there. Like, what would be a VHS add-on for Settlers of Catan?
We should.
Settlers of Catan had some actually mods that were like addressing the sort of like the terra nullius problem that in like it's kind of like based on Vikings, right? And Vikings have like are a very convenient choice because if you're essentially simulating Iceland, that's pretty much the only case in history in which
there was Europeans,
no one there. Get to this like land and nobody's there. But yeah, so there are like some like mods for Settlers of Catan that are talking about maybe like environmental issues or maybe colonialist issues, but they are like still like mechanical, right? So you have to actually test the law and you have to download, add different cards. But with a YouTube video.
Yeah, a few weeks ago I watched a video that is an alternative audio track for the first episode of Stranger Things that transforms the whole thing into a musical about the dangers of jazz. It's very good. You have to hit play on the YouTube video and then hit play on Netflix at a specific time. So I think hacking games would be another perfectly good use for that.
I'm thinking that could be like an assignment for my class. Just make a video that is meant to be played on an existing board game, and that completely changes or modify or enhance, gives it a different angle.
And it would be very hard to commercialize it, but just releasing it and getting it in front of people would be super easy. YouTube.
Yeah.
Oh,
How do we wrap it up?
I think we've explored a lot
by telling people make your own.
Yeah, no, please. I think Paolo Pedercini needs to say.
No, you should address your people.
Yeah. But we're speaking in English now.
Okay, I will address everybody.
I can say make your own videos hacking different board games. And you can say, I'm Paolo Pedercini and I endorse this message.
I'm Paolo Pedercini and I endorse this message.
I think that's about it for the episode. Paolo, many thanks for coming here and talking with us.
And for playing this game with us a few years ago and submitting yourself.
Fix your VHS. Let's do it.
We need to do this again. It's true.
All right.
En Busca de Porko is a podcast by Matajuegos. Read us at mata.juegos with a J. Find us on Facebook and YouTube as Matajuegos, or on Twitter and Instagram as Matajueguitos with GU. Write to us wherever you find us, and rate and review us wherever you're listening. Find Pablo on Twitter as pfquarta with a Q. Find my games at davidtmarchand.itch.io. Our guest today was Paolo Pedercini. Find his work at molleindustria.org with 2 L's. The voice for the commercial break was Ali Smalley. Find her on Twitter at Ali_Smalley. This episode's music was Jesse Styles' song for Paolo's 2009 game, Every Day the Same Dream. Today's phrase, from the back of VHStanciero's box. I know this is a little weird, but please give it a try. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, but you can certainly teach your friends to hit play and follow the instructions.